Welcome, everybody. My name is Dan Winslow. I'm the president of the New England Legal Foundation. We're really excited to have an interesting and timely topic of discussion for our first event of 2024. Before I introduce the leader of the gang here, I want to just make a couple of remarks about who we are. NELF is a nonpartisan nonprofit 501c3 founded in 1977 to advocate for economic liberty, free enterprise, property rights, limited government based on rule of law, and inclusive growth in the New England states. We largely accomplish that by amicus brief, friend of the court advocacy in state and federal courts to help shape the law in a way to be favorable to business. But we also do CLE and thought leadership. And we're open for membership to anybody who's interested in supporting that mission. Principally, our supporters are law firms, corporate legal departments, foundations, and individuals. We're very thankful for all of those supporters for powering our work. I also want to take the opportunity to pitch the next event in January. We have a regular speaker series called the Economic Liberty Breakfast Series. And on January 30th, columnist Ira Stahl is going to be with us in person, also available by Zoom for the northern and far southern New England states that would like to participate. Talking about making the case for free enterprise. Survey data shows that popularity for socialism is now neck and neck with the popularity of capitalism among young adults. We'd like to talk about that and the implications of that. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Jeff Clements. Jeff is the CEO of American Promise, a group that has developed an expertise in the role of money in politics and the law in the United States. And he's here with his colleagues that he'll introduce shortly to talk about some of the challenges, some of the implications, as well as some possible solutions that they wanted to posit. We'll open the floor up for a Q&A afterwards. Now, I did promise, Jeff, that in lieu of a speaker's fee, I would wear this hat on his behalf. So I wanted to just hold up my end of the bargain. But without any further ado, Jeff, an entrepreneur, a lawyer, a public servant in the past, as well as now, I think, a social warrior, a social justice warrior. So, Jeff, thrilled to have you here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dan. We're so happy to be here with Judge Winslow and all the folks at the New England Legal Foundation and the good work that you all do all around New England. I personally want to say hello to my old friends in Portland, Maine, who will be tuning in on the recording, where I first started practicing law many years ago. Before moving down to Boston and serving in the Attorney General's office and then practicing at Mintz and here in Boston. So it's good to be back among my lawyer and New England friends. So thank you. Thank you so much. What we're going to do today is introduce a topic that's on the minds of a lot of Americans. We'll show you more data on this, but basically there is a deep feeling among Americans that things have gotten out of hand with money in politics. Doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, or independent, you're about the same in terms of numbers on this level, where 7 out of 10 Americans think American democracy is under threat. And 86% of Republicans and 86% of Democrats, the same number, say money in politics is the number one reason. It's no longer a wonky campaign finance issue that, only the wonky campaign finance lawyers need to pay attention to. It's something that just about every American is paying attention to because they're feeling it in their communities, in their own lives, and in the dysfunctional politics we see. What's talked about less, though, is its impact on business and free enterprise. And what we're going to do today is actually start with non-lawyers. Down at the end, my co-founder of American Promise, John Wass. I'll leave it to the speakers to introduce themselves as they go, but my old friend John helped scale up Staples when it was I think there was one store when John started at Staples here in Boston, and there were a lot more stores when John left. So helped scale Staples, helped build 2 other companies since then, sold his last one to Cardinal Health. And while starting American Promise with me, couldn't help starting another one called Profit Isle. So he is CEO of Profit Isle, and free enterprise is in his DNA and in many ways in the DNA of American Promise. So we'll draw some connections between the business issues and the free enterprise aspirations that I think all Americans have. And although some of Dan's data may suggest there's a divide on free enterprise and economic opportunity. And, there's a lot of divides driven by this problem as we'll try to unpack it. Next, Leo Sprecher will share more. He's helps lead Bud Foods in New Hampshire with selling food and pies around a large market in the Northeast and around the country. He'll tell you more about that and why he's with American Promise. Then we're going to get to the lawyers again. My friends and colleagues at American Promise, Brian Boyle, General Counsel, Executive Director, and Julie Brogan, Senior Legal Counsel. And they'll walk us through some slides that I think you'll find illuminating. So with that, I will just say very briefly a couple of background points that I want to emphasize on American Promise. I got involved after doing a brief in the Citizens United case in the Supreme Court, went out to Montana, helped defend the state's anti-corruption laws when I was still practicing here in Boston. And then I learned something that I had never learned as a lawyer, and maybe many of you hadn't, which is the American people are actually really good at constitutional law. If there's an issue, people really get it. I saw that in Montana. The Montana Supreme Court upheld the 100-year-old anti-corruption law that Montana, Massachusetts, many states had throughout the 20th century. And it had been challenged after Citizens United. It went up to the U.S. Supreme Court without a hearing, summary reversal of a state Supreme Court. So much for federalism. No hearing, summary reversal, Montana and all the other anti-corruption laws struck down. But that wasn't the end of the story. I then saw 40,000 Montanans sign a petition in 4 weeks, and it was on the ballot in November 2012, saying we in Montana disagree with the Supreme Court. We call for a constitutional amendment to reverse that decision, and we instruct our congressional delegation to get the amendment out of Congress back to Montana and the states for ratification. That was on the ballot November 2012. Dan's old boss, Governor Mitt Romney, beat Barack Obama in Montana by 15 points, I think, 13 that year. Those very same voters passed this ballot initiative, 75% yes. So that's when we knew that Americans could handle this debate. We could build this campaign at American Promise to actually invite all Americans to see if we can get a better constitutional rule about money in politics than the free-for-all notion that any money from anywhere, from anything is free speech and there's nothing we can do about it. We think we can do better with what we call the 4R Freedom Amendment, and Brian and Julie will unpack that for us. So with no further ado, let me pass it over to the practitioners of free enterprise down at the end of the table. We'll start with John Wass.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to NELF for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity. And this nexus of economics and money in politics is near and dear to our hearts. Listening to your opening remarks, I just resonated with, I truly believe, and I think when people think a lot about capitalism, what they really are talking about is free enterprise. I do business and have done business around the world. And when I see capitalism in authoritarian states, it has a completely different complexion. It isn't free enterprise. It's you work as hard as you can until someone takes it away from you. And so one of the things that I think is really important is that what makes America, America, what makes the United States, is the interaction of the economic system of free enterprise with democracy, a functioning democracy. And the reason I co-founded this with Jeff is my 3 sons have given me a very similar report that you mentioned, which is they're scratching their heads and going, I don't know about this capitalism thing. And what they're reacting to isn't, I think, the way that a lot of people in our generation think of free enterprise, where everyone basically has an equal opportunity to compete. What they're reacting to is a perception now that the government is intervening and creating an unfair economic advantage for a subset of organizations and corporations and entities in this economy. So when we talk about what it is, I think we have to be very careful about the naming, because when we talk about free enterprise, I think the vast majority of people actually do believe in it. But when they look at what's happening now, they go, this stinks. This isn't what I signed up for. So the reason that we're here at American Promise is we know that if we don't invigorate some of the core principles that made the United States great and put it back into the Constitution and basically reverse what the Supreme Court did, money is not speech. And the fact that we are in this business now where we basically tried to make a business out of politics, we've broached two critical spheres of society, and that is a fundamental flaw that we're working to change. So I'm very excited about the work that you guys do. I actually didn't know about it, so it's very exciting. But what we're doing is making sure that the core principles of the United States are put back in the Constitution. And we believe that when we do that, this next generation will begin to understand the real benefit of democracy and free enterprise together. And we really, when we have this conversation with people, they get it, they work with us, and we hope that we find more people like you that understand this and help us spread the word. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I as well thank you so much for this opportunity. This is terrific. I'm not an official person in the American Promise group, but an avid supporter. And so I thought I'd just tell you, it was suggested I tell you a little bit about me. I'm a trained engineer, and then I turned finance management guy. And for the last 35 years, I've been the president of a food manufacturing company, Mrs. Bud's. We make the Mrs. Bud's chicken pies, which are pretty well known in New England, but we go out as far as Chicago with our products. And it's just an all-American chicken pie. So that's who I am. But what matters to me is that I'm the father of 3 sons, just like John, and very increasingly worried about what we're handing them. And so my journey started about 10 years ago. Already saw the fractures in the system. You didn't have to be too bright, by the way, to do that, but that's began to worry me. And I realized that if people like me don't get in the middle of this, don't pull the wagon, we're not going to have a shot here. And so I got involved looking, first of all, I had no idea who's working on this. Your regular daily life, you just go to work, family, you keep reading the newspapers. And so there's a real worry about, is there anyone working on it? So I spent a number of years sort of kicking the tires and discovered lots of really amazing people are working on democracy repair. And I joined about 3 or 4 groups that I'm actively involved with, still seeking that question of what is the right single thing to push the hardest. As I was learning more about this, I ran into one of the conferences. There was a woman, her name is Meredith McGehee, who was asked by the conference to present a chart showing all the suggested repairs to our democracy that would fix the system. And there were things everyone has heard of. Working on the ethics in Congress, gerrymandering, even PACs at that time were perceived as trouble. There's just a long list, about 15 of them, and she was asked to put it in a scattergram. On one axis, she listed the difficulty of getting it to happen. And on the other axis, she showed the likely impact it would have in terms of reforming the system. So there's 15 dots laid on a chart with the X and Y axis. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but the group was surprised. It was almost a perfect 45-degree line. And what that says is that the amount of work you put into a reform is about what it takes to have a certain amount of impact. Translation, our government is a perfect free market. People have been bought into the various points of control in proportion to their value of extracting essentially unfair advantage over the system. That's because government was never meant for that, but our government is essentially pretty efficiently bought and legally, which is the part that was so troubling. So as I was watching this, there was a veteran who's been in this business a long time, a top executive of a very big financial pension firm, very brilliant guy. And he noticed my sort of naive, like, oh my God, moment. And he said to me, just want you to know, not a single one of these reforms makes a damn bit of difference if you can't turn the money that's pouring in from on top into the system. It's not like you can work on one fix, and you have to turn that spigot off. And he said, if you cannot undo Citizens United, you don't have a shot. And that was his conclusion after working a long time, a big funder of one of these democracy groups. He's still there. And so it just struck me, concentrated wealth and its interests now essentially by our government decision-making. And so if you're wondering about this, like how bad is it? You're going to see some charts as well. But a striking number is that before Citizens United, all the campaigns together, state, local, federal, were about $5 billion per year. And now it's over 20 billion. And that just says it all, So I'm here basically to work on this project. I think American Promise has the very best shot of doing this, not only in getting the amendment, but being the instigator of the conversation. Yeah, that's why I'm here.
Well, thank you so much, Leo. Really appreciate that. So we're going to move from the business people, and there are many more around the country who are supporting this effort. We have a national business network. We invite all business leaders to get in touch or look up what we're doing and sign on. We work with chambers, we work with business people around the country who are telling these kind of stories and saying enough of the politics. We're going to step in and help the situation. So thank you both, John and Leo. We're now going to take you through a deck. I'm going to turn it over to Brian and Julie that I think will show some interesting background to go a little deeper, show some of the data, show the amendment language. We've kept you in suspense about the solution. It's coming, and then we'll have time for your questions, both here in the room and on the live stream. So, Brian?
Actually,
okay. Julie.
Yeah, I'm going to start.
And both Julie and Brian, I should have said, in case they don't themselves, are veterans of Boston law practice, and I'll just leave it there. So.
Yeah. So, well, what we're going to talk about today is a presentation based on a presentation that we were honored to give to the American Bar Association's Task Force on American Democracy. And it focuses on the question of who gets to fix this problem, who gets to deal with the problem of money in elections. But as John was saying, it's important that we have in a capitalist or a free market system a stable democracy. And what we find is public opinion that the state of American democracy is quite dismal. These are some results of a poll that was conducted in September of 2023. So it's very recent, about 4 months old, by the Pew Research Center. And it was a comprehensive survey of Americans' opinions of the system. And as you can see, a collection of negative adjectives, the most prominent of which means they were repeated the most often, were that the system is divisive and corrupt, and that the American people just feel like Congress is not doing their job. When asked what the problem is, people will say that they don't feel that the representatives in Congress they have any influence over the representatives in Congress. Who do the American people think has the most influence? They cite campaign donors, lobbyists, and within the district, mostly businesses, but not ordinary Americans. And if you think back to your original understanding of American government, we're a representative democracy. We, the people, are supposed to be whom our representatives are representing. And this is the perception that Americans have of how the government is not working. And it's fair to ask at this point whether this perception is in fact reality. We've known for 10 years that this perception is a fact. There's quantitative data from a study that was conducted out of Princeton in 2014 that ordinary Americans have virtually no influence on public policy in America compared to business interests. Lobbyists for special focused interest groups are much more likely to have their influence reflected in American public policy. So the perception is the reality. And one example of something that people would like to see is a reduction in the spending in our elections. And yet lawmakers are hamstrung in their ability to do that. And I'll just quickly go through this slide. When you see that big bubble that said people think the system is corrupt, they're not thinking of bribery. They're not thinking of the quid pro quo corruption. They're thinking of the more pernicious co-opting of the system and by moneyed interests. They say that, if the biggest qualification to run for office today is your ability to raise money, you may not be the best person for the job. Americans see their members of Congress enter a revolving door in Washington, where after they leave, the majority will go into the very lobbying firms and law firms that tried to influence them when they were members. And one of the most shocking statistics is that members of Congress spend about 30 to 50% of their time raising money. So it's a fact that they are actually listening to donors more than the American people. Brian's going to go over how we got here, who is in charge of regulating campaign finance in the United States and the problem with that. But as he does so, I'd like you to keep this timeline in mind. This is the perennial survey of Americans' trust in government. And you see that after the Second World War, we were at an all-time high, and it began to decline during the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement. But it's very important that even during those turbulent periods of American history in the 20th century, the majority of Americans still had faith in our government, and there was stability. The first time it dipped below 50%, and I would argue that this is when the democracy began to crack, was during the Watergate era. And it reached a low of 34%, and Americans demanded that there be some anti-corruption legislation. And the post-Watergate Congress responded with the Federal Election Campaign Act. They set limits on the size of contributions to campaigns and limits on the overall spending that a campaign could undertake. But when FICA, that law, came before the Supreme Court in 1976 in the case of Buckley v. Vallejo, those limits on spending hit a roadblock. And since that time, which was 50 years ago, we've never been able to recover from the pre-Watergate level of majority trust in government. There was one exception. You'll see the little blip during the Bush administration. That was 9/11, and it's an aberration. And if you look at the 21st century, you see the adoption of the Buckley Doctrine to allow even more money to flood into the system. And we find ourselves today with only 20% of Americans having any faith in the government. That means 80% lack faith in our system. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who will tell us how we're going to get out of this.
All right. Thanks again, Dan, for having us. And so I know that NELF's audience has business folks and lawyers. We're going to get a little bit constitutional law nerdy for a bit, if you don't mind. But I'd like to just first zoom out and say, the Constitution is a structural document, and it really is meant to answer some big questions like who gets to decide X, Y, or Z. So I like to think about this question of money in politics is who should get to decide whether and how we regulate money. And what has happened since 1976 is that the Supreme Court accepted an invitation to basically make itself the chief decision maker about whether and how to regulate money in politics. But before 1976, if you were to just open up your Constitution and try to look for the answer, who should get to decide whether we regulate money in politics, you'd come across Article 1, Section 4, which seems to contemplate that actually the states and the legislatures in the states should be able to set rules around the time, place, and manner of holding elections. And Congress can get involved if it wishes. And this is obviously for federal elections. But it seems to contemplate that the political branches should be the ones making decisions about how our electoral system is set up and the different rules that go into it. And for the first 185 years of the Constitution's existence, that's pretty much how things were going. And then in 1976, a bunch of clever, enterprising lawyers came up with the theory that actually, if we conceived of speech as being basically equivalent to the spending of money, well, suddenly that gives us a hook to have the judiciary step in and start policing it. And because the judiciary is conventionally thought to be the number one determiner of what the meaning of the First Amendment is, well, we can get the judiciary to strike down laws of money in politics that we don't like. And so that's what happened in Buckley versus Vallejo. But, I just want to sort of paint a picture of when we invoke the Buckley Doctrine, it has a few really important parameters that have carried through for the past 50 years. First, it basically said spending money is tantamount to the expression of ideas. And so we're going to filter everything through a First Amendment analysis. The court told lower courts to apply exacting scrutiny, where we're not going to give deference to state and federal policymakers. We, the judiciary, are going to take a close look and decide whether we think that the regulations advance a sufficiently important interest. Julie alluded to this a little bit when she mentioned quid pro quo corruption. The court has recognized only one justification for campaign finance regulation, and it's the prevention of quid pro quo corruption. And it has basically said, if you're talking about political equality or fairness or an interest in making sure everybody's voice gets heard, that is off the table. Legislatures can't even consider it. And then finally, it allowed for some limits on contributions. And for those that are coming to kind of money in politics regulation for the first time, just think of the contribution as like money you give directly to a campaign. So Buckley said you could have some limits on that, but you can't have any limits on things that are considered expenditures. But now, 50 years later, expenditures includes any money that goes to a super PAC that supports a candidate. Because those super PACs are technically not controlled by the candidate, they're considered independent expenditures. Unlimited amounts of money can flow into them. But even back in 1976, there were those who were thinking, maybe this isn't setting us up for success. So there was a dissent by Justice White, who made the point, again, sort of who gets to decide. He's saying it's curious that the court here is striking down a law that was passed by a bipartisan Congress, signed into law by the president, and the court is saying we know better than those two co-equal branches of government. At American Promise, we take originalism seriously, and we think that the Buckley Doctrine is not consistent with the original public meaning of the First Amendment. There's some really excellent recent scholarship published in the Yale Law Journal, which talks about how back when the First Amendment was ratified, it was understood that there could be regulation to promote the general welfare. And the quote here is saying, even assuming that there is an expressive component to giving money, the founders would have totally thought that this was fair game for regulation and to promote the general welfare. So the court has basically put us in a situation where they're the one that gets to call the shots. But there's another possibility, and that's the one that we want to share with you today. Jeff already mentioned that the people of Montana sort of woke up to the fact that actually we get to make constitutional law too if we want. And, Article 5 of the Constitution gives us the ability to step in when we think the court has gotten it wrong. Just want to zoom out to some of the fundamentals because we've been kind of talking about money in politics, which can seem maybe a little dry, but the reason it's so important is because it gets to this fundamental question of representation and popular sovereignty, the American people actually being the ones that have power in the system. Back in the late 1770s and 80s, when the Constitution was being framed, Madison knew that in a vast republic that was going to stretch from sea to sea and have millions of people of different preferences and values, if you want to have government by the people, you need to implement that in a way. And the way that they came up with implementing it was through representation, which involves a relationship between constituents and a representative. And this seems pretty straightforward, right? You can think about, okay, well, within the constituent bubble, there's all sorts of folks. There's businesses and civic associations and residents. And there's also a small number of folks that happen to be donors, which is totally fine. But we now live in a system where on the other side of this equation, there's all these influences that are non-constituent donors, non-constituent independent expenditures that are able to bring tremendous resources to bear in an effort to influence and access the people that are supposed to be representing their constituents. And the Supreme Court has said that all of that influence and access is not corruption. It's not a form of corruption, and there's nothing legislators can do about it. We take a different view, and our amendment focuses on the ability to have truly representative self-government by basically strengthening that relationship that was back in the day originally intended to be the central component of the American Republic. Self-government doesn't just matter for reasons of popular sovereignty. This vision involves a better view and a better working system of free enterprise, where businesses would be competing based on the value that they're bringing to bear and not based on their ability to earn favors or preferences in a pay-to-play system. So we've got this amendment going. And for those of you that are in the room, we have it on the napkin. We would encourage you to take it with you because it is quite simple. You can see the three sections here, and I'm going to just take a couple minutes to go through each one quickly. So section 1 of the amendment is where we basically say the regulation of money in politics. The reason that's important is because it goes to our sovereign interests in self-government. So we recognize here that the people have compelling sovereign interests in freedom of speech, representative self-government, federalism, the integrity of the electoral process, and the political equality of natural persons. And the reason these are all there is we're basically sending a message to the court that yes, quid pro quo corruption matters, but all these other things are in the mix too, and legislatures should be able to consider them when they're deciding whether and how to regulate money. I couldn't help myself but just pull this out of a recently filed lawsuit in Maine. This was just a month ago. So Maine just passed with 86% support of the electorate a law that would ban foreign government money spending in their ballot initiatives. And within a month, foreign government spenders filed suit in federal court saying, oh, we actually have a First Amendment right to spend this money in your American elections. And what is so crazy is that the Supreme Court has given them a plausible argument by saying that the interest in, quote, protecting democratic self-government is not recognized as a compelling interest. And that's actually the basis of the Supreme Court. Jeff alluded to the Supreme Court just summarily rejecting Montana's anti-corruption laws. If you look at the Supreme Court of Montana's decision, it's all about how we need these laws to protect democratic self-government in Montana. The Supreme Court said it doesn't matter. So that's why we say actually representative self-government is a compelling sovereign interest. The next section of the amendment is really about dejudicializing campaign finance. And it says the court should be giving deference to the political branches, the states and Congress, giving them the ability to reasonably regulate in the area of money and politics. And I just want to point out one thing, which is that some folks, when they think about dejudicializing this, they get nervous, like, oh, well, what about all these terrible laws that could be passed? And the thing I like to remind folks of is that from an error correction standpoint, our amendment is significantly better, because right now, if the Supreme Court creates a dumb rule of campaign finance, the only way to fix it is through a constitutional amendment. But once this amendment is placed, I'm sure you will get dumb campaign finance laws, but the way to fix them will be through the normal majoritarian process. You mobilize in your state, you mobilize in Congress, you say, we passed this law, but it's not working, let's change it. So this is better from an error correction standpoint. And then lastly, we have Section 3, which empowers Congress and the states to implement this. And it allows them, see, this is the thing, it's permissive, right? It gives the power back to the states and Congress. It doesn't require anything in particular. It allows them to draw distinctions between actual human beings and artificial entities, but it doesn't require it. And so from sort of the perspective of what makes sense as a constitutional amendment, this is smart, right? It doesn't prescribe any particular outcome, but it gives flexibility to Congress and the states to deal with the threat as it continues to change. And then I'll briefly just end with some of our national polling on this. So we asked in a recent national poll, the top question is about whether folks would support a proposed constitutional amendment along these lines. And you can see it's between 73 and almost 82% support. Very little difference across the partisan spectrum. And in terms of progress, there have been 22 states so far that have called on Congress to propose such an amendment. Most of this has been through bicameral resolutions in the state legislature, but also I think we have 6 to 7 ballot initiatives at this point that have also done it. And then just wanted to end, for those of you that are interested in learning more and getting involved, wanted to point you to some resources. Julie mentioned that we had the opportunity to share this presentation with the American Bar Association Task Force for American Democracy. We've got our working paper there, but one of the things we're trying to do is because the task force is planning to issue their formal report and recommendations in August, we're trying to mobilize as many of our supporters as we can to share their views with that task force to make sure that it is something that they consider. So you can do that through either contacting the task force members, or you could also just sign our open letter from legal professionals, and that gives us a way to kind of loop you into our efforts. So I think at this point, we'd love to just open it up to questions that folks have. And thanks again.
Cool. Just have so in terms of process, what kind of reception are you getting by the political class, that is congressmen and U.S. senators? How I understand about the Joe voter and Jane voter, but how about the electeds?
Yeah, I take that one. Individually, they're all very supportive because they hate the fact that they have to raise money all the time. The real politic of it is no one is going to step up and unilaterally disarm. No one's going to stand up and say, I'm not going to take money. It doesn't work that way. You just get destroyed and someone else will take money and pick it up. So, and our expectation is that when this will break, when the country needs a change, and we've seen this, we saw January 6th, we probably have something coming up in the future that will look not dissimilar to that. And Congress will get together and look for a way into the future that will reestablish and hold on to our democracy. And this continues to be a very real pathway forward for both Republican and Democratic congresspeople, because when you talk to them one-on-one, both of them have very strong, deeply held beliefs that support this. And they're different, but they lead to the same place.
So now just take another question since you have the floor, but as business owners, as business people, I would imagine that you are constantly the object of requests for funding by your various elected representatives, and particularly if you have a regulated entity, for example, food service is a regulated entity, it would put you in a pretty awkward position, I would imagine, to have a public official ask you for money and with the use of your corporate resources to say yay or nay. And I'm curious, even though it's not required by the amendment as written, do you think there'd be value for businesses, for free enterprise, to be sort of absent, to be AWOL or removed from this ask?
So I'll take that. There are a number of groups that work entirely in the business community, working on this democracy repair. And one whole initiative is chambers of commerce and business leaders all around the country. And each business leader has the same dilemma that John just referred to, which is they know this is an awful way to be, and it's non-productive. That it's just to keep up with the opposing influencers. But there are quiet places where they can get away with it, where they reduce the amount of funding to government agencies and individuals. But it is a very complicated place to be. They would much rather have it solved in the public forum. And I think it's the right place for it to be, because we've gotten to the point where big companies are way better off getting a small tweak out of Congress to improve their profitability than to create a new, more productive idea. That lobbyists, little suitcases of money and looking good are way better investments than some of the R&D for some of these companies. So you have a very big problem here. And you have to crack it, I think, in the way that American Promise is looking at it.
Could I just add an anecdote about an experience we're having in Pennsylvania right now? So in Pennsylvania, we have a proposed resolution in support of the amendment. There's a version in the House sponsored by a Democrat and a version in the Senate sponsored by a Republican. But one of our biggest sources of support has been the local chambers of commerce, including the Harrisburg Chamber of Commerce. And part of it is, it's the reason that you mentioned, Dan, where especially for small and mid-sized businesses who they feel like there's no way they can even compete with some of their bigger outside competitors in this money game. And so for them, they see the opportunity of being able to kind of like create incentives in the system that don't require them to compete in that way anymore. They can compete on their merits.
Even some of the big businesses, I'll just add, don't look at this is not a win for them. For many of them, IBM has long had a rule about no political contributions. And when you have the rule, you can say no without offending the elected official. Pirelli Tire, another one, global public company. And they have a rule globally that we don't give political contributions. We don't do election spending. And they have joined this cause. Their American subsidiary in Rome, Georgia, is on board because they'd like to see a level playing field where companies are competing on the merits. And they'll have policy views, of course, nothing wrong with that. Theirs are helpful to the process. And lobbyists will have a role to play without the suitcases of money. They'll be able to do policy advocacy. But the money game is not a winner, even for the biggest companies at this point.
There's always a bigger fish. Someone always has more money.
I have a question from online. This comes from Andrew Bloom. Other organizations like Public Citizen are working on this. Is there cross-pollination happening? And why are we not hearing about prominent people who have loudly talked about the money and politics issue actively and boldly promoting the FOF amendment? Examples: Liz Warren, Robert Reich, Lawrence Lessing, Bernie Sanders, AOC, etc.
I'll take that one because I've been at this a long time and have some friends at Public Citizen, and they won't be offended when I say Public Citizen and all of those names just mentioned will not get this done. A strategy that is only left and not right, or that is only right and not left, cannot deliver 2/3 of Congress, which is what we need, and then ratification in 38 state legislatures. It takes a force like American Promise, where this is the only thing we do. Public Citizen has a long list. All those distinguished representatives who were mentioned have a long list of policy priorities that will rightly cause debate and division about different points of view. We focus only on this, so it allows Americans, no matter who you vote for, to be a part of it. So I will actually, confession, be on a call with Bernie Sanders and Public Citizen tomorrow evening. But we also go to CPAC and ALEC, and that's what it takes. So the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment actually has not been introduced in Congress yet. The Democracy for All Amendment is a very similar counterpart. We have some differences in this one, but it's a good amendment. Tom Udall introduced it. Most of the people mentioned support that, including Senator Warren and most of the Democrats. So we actually are grateful to Senator Warren and other Democrats that they're not being too loud about the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment, because we'd like to see it introduced by Republicans in the House. And that's just not because we're critical of what the Democrats have introduced. We need both parties to have their own flag to fly on this, and then we're going to bring them together in the next year or two. So it's good to hear the question from Andrew, who's been a big supporter. We appreciate it, Andrew, all your good work. And it's a really good question. And what we'd like to see is a good debate in the House and the Senate about federalism, about free speech, about the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment versus the Democracy for All Amendment. When we have that debate, we're almost at the tipping point where we're going to get a good, strong amendment out of Congress and back to the states for ratification. And every American will get a chance to weigh in. That's the beauty of this process. It's not something that happens like that. Every American will get a chance to be heard on this.
Yeah, so my question is, there's no doubt that the political elites, right, the elected officials in Congress are benefiting from there being a lack of campaign finance reform. So the first question I wanted to ask is, and then I have one to follow up that, is what are arguments that they are bringing up, I guess, against campaign finance reform? And then, like, how are they effectively fighting back against this, and what arguments are they using? And then my second question is, in your presentation, you guys showed how both Republicans and Democrats, as far as like, your average citizen, are on board with campaign finance reform. So if they seem to agree with this issue, why hasn't there been campaign finance reform passed in the past? And why does it feel like this is only a one-sided partisan issue?
What side is the partisan side?
So, I mean, to me, it seems like only like the progressives are advocating for this. I'm not seeing enough from like conservatives or Republicans that are fighting or that are trying to pass campaign finance reform. Okay. But that's just like my stipulation. Maybe I'm wrong. So.
Yeah,
I didn't know which side you were talking about.
Right, yeah.
I'll weigh in on that and then pass it to the team here to add. I think that perception was accurate 5 years ago, and even somewhat today. It's why we launched American Promise, actually, because there was not a voice on the right for this. I think what happened was the Supreme Court, and to your point about what's the argument against it, well, the Supreme Court, they're very smart people. We respect the court. 5 of them thought this was the right approach. 4 of them didn't. And we've now had 10 to 15 years since the Citizens United decision, and I think most Americans have given it an open hearing. We all love free speech, and I think most Americans have come around to the conclusion the court was wrong. But it's certainly a worthy debate. The First Amendment and the role of money in speech, it's a serious issue. We think our approach is better, and that the American people decide the issue. That's what the First Amendment will mean, and it will protect free speech for everybody. But so when the court first decided it, the reaction came from the left because it was a conservative court. The Republicans were actually ready. Mitch McConnell was ready to go, and they got the head start on spending money, on dark money, all the things we all see today. And so the Democrats reacted. And so it became kind of partisan at the beginning. Democrats now are 2-1 in dark money against Republicans. Democrats are spending enormous amounts of money.
Yeah, both of them are benefiting.
Yeah, and that's
Or
the
we're losing. It really depends on how you think about it.
yeah, benefiting or losing. And there've been enough losses on both sides that now you're starting to see, oh, maybe this doesn't work for us. And so the Republicans, you see the numbers, it's 80% support, but they had nowhere to go until American Promise came along. So we're getting as big as fast as we can. And, you know, the leader of that Maine campaign, 86% in November, was Senator Rick Bennett, who was the GOP leader in Maine. He was the Senate president, Republican in Maine, a very respected Republican senator, led the fight on that. We're seeing it in Pennsylvania, Brian mentioned. So the Republicans are now catching up. They're letting their voice be heard, and they have somewhere to go. And this 4-Hour Freedom Amendment, we think, can be a real rallying point on the right, left, and center, frankly. Do you want to add to any of that about the arguments against this or otherwise?
Well, I think John mentioned something really important, which is that privately, these folks do not enjoy what the system requires of them. Like, they do not love having to spend 50% of their time crossing the street to go to a different building to dial for money. And I think that if there were a reset, then they would, it's not just for our freedom, it's for their freedom too. Like, they would be free from that burden, and they could actually spend more time earning votes by being with constituents instead of thinking that you need millions of dollars to, you know, douse the airwaves and television with ads.
I think, you know, the rationale for this was a single connection that we didn't think existed, but was created by the Supreme Court, which is convoluting speech with money. So that's when you ask why do they defend it, that's how they defend it, because that's how they won. The reason that they're shifting is there are 3 key things that the very conservative group will consistently support. They don't want anybody else electing their local school board. Pisses them off like you can't imagine. And it pisses anybody off. And that's what's happening, right, left, and backwards. And the vast majority of the people are going, this is not right. We're seeing the money trickle all the way down to that local dinky little election of the school board in your hometown. And now it affects how your kids are being educated. And it's terrifying. And they also know that that money is coming from overseas. They know now that this money is coming from China, North Korea, it's coming from Iran. I mean, you pick it, it's coming here to destabilize our country, because you saw that we hamstrung ourselves. We said, we can't defend ourselves. We're not going to defend this democracy. You know, just take that off the table. It's like, you got to be freaking kidding me. So you have that conversation with anyone that's conservative, and they light up like a Christmas tree. So they're just as excited about this as we are. And it's coming home. It's no longer just the presidential campaign that's, you know, it's that thing. It is real. It is in your backyard. And we have this conversation, you know, we travel a lot. We're all over the country. And it resonates everywhere. So this is not a partisan issue, but when you talk about a conservative mindset or political ideology, we now resonate deeply with that. And as we mentioned before, that leadership is stepping up now. In the vast majority of states are controlled by Republicans. So, you know, this is going to go through because 38 states ratify this, and it's going to be because Republicans step up and say, we need this.
And one of the reasons why we include federalism in Section 1 is because I'll just give you a quick example. About a year ago in Wisconsin was the most expensive Supreme Court race in U.S. history. Hundreds of millions of dollars, I think like $330 million went into that race. And the majority of it was from outside of Wisconsin. So when you're in Wisconsin, as I was in August at a county fair talking with people, they feel incensed by the idea that the outcome of that race was influenced primarily by people who are outside of Wisconsin's borders. And that calls into question, you know, this fundamental principle of federalism, the idea that Wisconsin should be able to have its own say on certain things, and Utah and Wyoming. And that is becoming increasingly hard to preserve when you have a hyper-nationalized system with donor zip codes.
Hyper-internationalized.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question on just tactics, and I'm just curious in terms of how you go from idea to implementation. For folks that are involved in campaigns, it's a common tactic to collect ballot signatures for 2 ballot questions at one time, because you've got one volunteer collecting 2 ballot petition sheets. There are other constitutional amendment activities cooking. Mm-hmm. The one that I've heard of that would seem to me to have cross-partisan appeal would be, we have a minimum age for presidency, and now there's some thought about maybe we should constitutionally have a maximum age for presidency. I think the proposal under consideration is that, nobody who would be over the age of 75 upon taking the oath of office is eligible to run for the office of president. I would think, there'd be some interest in both sides.
Can we add the Senate to that?
Well, the one that I've heard of is for the presidency. And so I'm curious, has there been any discussion? Would there be any value to hitching wagons of, what might be at least first glance popular efforts, or is it just better to uncloud or unclutter the effort, just make it stand alone on your own 2 feet, tactically?
Both. I think, because we have to have mission focus. Amendments aren't easy, and have one clear mission. We're doing this amendment. There's no bait and switch. You're not going to sign up for this and then find yourself in another amendment. But you also have to be aware of other constitutional arguments going on, because what we found when we set out our game plan, the tactics, is amendments actually happen in bunches. So we did 4 amendments between 1961 and 1971, 4 amendments between 1910 and 1920, 3 amendments after the Civil War. So we get in these, and those were all tough periods like they are now in America. And so you get in these periods where Americans are ready for a constitutional renewal. And if you're not connecting with the different constitutional conversations, you're going to be left out of the conversation that Americans want to have. So we do. We have board members who are all in on this. They also want to see a fiscal responsibility amendment. It used to be called the Balanced Budget Amendment. Now it's called the Fiscal Responsibility Amendment. We were at ALEC talking about many different proposals, including that one, although I heard a little bit different on term limits, but similar to an age one. So it's a conversation that's happening, and I think it's important that we're in that mix and respectful of all the ideas, because that's what makes this country great, and that's what'll get us out of this is that we actually accept that Americans can have constitutional ideas that are pretty darn good, and we can make it happen. So I don't know if others have any perspective you want to share on that, but it's a great question.
I have another question.
Sure.
Actually going to Brian's comment earlier. So, because you're making the argument that a lot of elected officials, like particularly within Congress, like they want campaign finance reform because they don't like the idea of having to constantly raise money, fundraise, and all of that. Because they would rather spend their time working with their constituents and doing legislative work. But my skepticism and argument is, well, what about the ones that have been in office for a long time, that have their set of loyal donors that just donate to them because they've pushed for policies that have benefited their donors a lot. And so, but they are remaining in their positions of power, and that's how they are also benefiting from this. And there's also another set of issues that comes with that, and that's also how congressmen are also enriching themselves in Congress by, through stocks and through other means of getting money that way. So how do you make this constitutional amendment to those that are already so deeply entrenched in power and corruption because they're personally enriching themselves? I'm thinking of Nancy Pelosi as an example.
So it's a great question. I'm going to hedge a little bit by just saying we need 290 in the House and 67 in the Senate. So that means there may be some people that never get on board, right? There may be some people that you work at it but even for those cases, they're up for election every 2 or 6 years. And when the people in their state are mobilized and taking action within their state legislature, this is going to be an issue that matters to them when that person comes up for re-election. And we do have a candidate pledge program where people go and they ask their candidates who are running for federal or state office, where are you on this? And, for some of those intransigent folks, it may come to a point where their constituents say, you're answering this question in a way that we don't like.
That is an hour, right? So I want to thank Jeff and everybody from American Promise for coming here and sharing the the problem, but also coming here with solutions. I respect people that have solutions, not just whining. so it's nice to have a conversation that includes a way out, at least one suggestion. And I want to just remind folks again that on January 30th at 8:30 in the morning here at the New England Legal Foundation, and also by Zoom for our supporters in the outlying states, Ira Stroll, columnist about free enterprise and making the case for why it matters. I want to thank everybody here. I want to thank you for joining us here in person. I want to thank also those who signed online. Again, I'm Dan Winslow, New England Legal Foundation. We're at newenglandlegal.org. Thanks all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.